Welcome to today's episode. Migration is front and center, and we're discussing today the contrasts between Africa and Europe when it comes to addressing migration. We're not just talking about policies, but we are trying to deconstruct different philosophies of the different parties that shape how each continent, Europe and Africa, handles migration. Let's get into it. With me today are two distinguished guests, Alan Hirsch, Research Fellow at the New South Institute. Welcome. And Ivan Martin, you're a Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. We'll try to explore where and how African and European perspectives converge, where they clash, but also whether a truly collaborative strategy exists or could exist when it comes to addressing migration. Let's bring some numbers. Over 70% of migration occurs within the continent, means in Africa. Facts that often is overshadowed by the European narratives on cross-Mediterranean flows. And beyond Europe's political sensitivity on migration, especially migration from Africa, this divergence stems from fundamentally different visions of the relationship between migration regulation and development in Africa. There is a stark political asymmetry as well in the partnership models that shape the relation between Europe and Africa. Alan, what's your say about it?
Well, of course, most Africans migrate within Africa. That's true. And Africans actually make up a very small proportion of the migrants to Europe. In the OECD tables, of the top 20 countries that have refugees seeking asylum in Europe, none are African, not a single one. And of those who are naturalized or seek naturalization, there's only one or two. So it's not a huge problem for Europe, but it is seen to be, and the portrayal of Africans who by far the majority of Africans who do migrate to Europe do so legally as well, not illegally, not irregularly. I think the interesting question is not really what happens now, but what is going to happen in the future, because over the next several decades, as the European population ages and as Africa continues to have something of a surplus of labor, how are we going to resolve that issue? And I think that there are some clues in current arrangements between Europe and Africa that might provide a way forward, but we have a way to go.
Ivan, any comments on this?
Well, I think that the first important thing is to normalize migration from Africa to Europe under current circumstances. Africa has lower migration rates than the world average. The world average now is 3.6% of total population. Africa doesn't even reach 3%, actually 2.6, 2.7%. This is increasing, that's true, but it is normal that it increases because Africa is in the midst of the demographic transition right now. And historically, all countries, all regions going through demographic transition have produced high levels of outward migration. Take Europe between 1848 and the First World War, 1914, it produced 40 million migrants to the Americas out of a population of 300 million, so 15%. My own country, Spain, produced 2 million migrants out of a population of 30 million in the 60s. So it is only normal that a continent going through a very swift, very fast demographic transition produces migration. Actually, we should ask ourselves what is going well in Africa that it doesn't produce more migration. There are 33 million new Africans every year, and actually not even 2 million of them migrate. So they are. This is a completely normal phenomenon. Even more so, if you take into account the huge difference in revenue rates, in income per capita. If you take the evolution over the last 30 years ago, the difference between the euro area and sub-Saharan African average was 1 to 10.8. 30 years later, it's 12 times more the euro area than average Africa. GDP per capita. So it is only natural on top of the demographic situation in Europe that Alan was mentioning, that migration is going to increase. And the issue is not whether it's going to happen or not, but how we manage it and how we optimize these migration flows.
In terms of the management and the optimization also of the migration flows, but also the challenges behind this migration cooperation, Europe has historically approached migration through a lens of partnerships, funding, and externalization also of some services to shape the management of the migration flows. Don't you think this approach maybe risks perpetuating the inequalities between Africa and Europe at some point?
Well, I don't think that it risks perpetuating inequalities, but it's certainly, historically, Europe has always managed migration through partnerships, but the big difference is in the 60s and the 70s, it organized partnerships for attracting labor into the European labor markets. Now it is establishing partnerships to avoid migration. This is a big difference. And in order to do so, it is to a certain level even harassing partner states in Africa and elsewhere, but mainly in Africa, to implement European policies on migration, on border control, on readmission, on fighting irregular migration. So I think it is rather at the level of values and the credibility of partnership in many other issues, not only migration, that's at stake when you talk about migration partnerships, rather than the perpetuation of inequalities, which I would say is determined rather for trade and other economic forces.
What do you think, Alan?
If I can add to that, I think there are different kinds of European partnerships with Africa. So there are partnerships which support the management of migration in some positive ways. I think we've seen fairly positive outcomes, for example, in the Horn of Africa, perhaps not so much in West Africa. But there are also what Europe calls talent partnerships, which are emerging. And that's where European countries establish relationships with countries in Africa to recruit people. And I think that's something that's beginning to snowball. I don't know if how quickly it's going to snowball, but we will see. So I think that the interesting thing where Europe is recruiting is to think about it in terms of, on the one hand, skilled people or highly skilled people, and on the other hand, the sort of low-skilled or medium-skilled people. And when it comes to the high-skilled people, I think Europe has little difficulty in recruiting engineers and doctors where they're needed. It's where you have people in the more labor-intensive industries, in the catering or in domestic work or in agriculture, where it's a bit more sensitive, I think, in Europe, and where it's a bit more complicated.
And I'd like to go back to you, Ivan. How do you see probably the way migration is managed by the European Union? Do you think that it influences somehow Africa's approach to migration? Like, is there indeed a sort of political and institutional push for Africa to align its migration policies with European concerns and standards?
Absolutely. I think that we have to be aware first that migration is not a high priority in most African countries. They have many other social issues. They are used to have, they have up to 80% of informal employment in many sub-Saharan countries. So having even a few millions more coming from other neighboring countries doesn't really change the context. This is first. And this is why many countries are actually accepting to outsource even the design of labor migration laws or migration laws to international organizations like IOM and others, which a country would never do in a main area of policy, first. Second, then the European Union has indeed a very politicized approach to migration, because this is being manipulated and used by extreme far-right movements in Europe. And it has become, I would say, a little bit hysterical about migration, and it needs to show that it is performing well in controlling irregular migration, regardless of any rational approach. And in doing so, is harassing somehow some of these partner states in order to indeed apply European policies or European determined policies.
Yeah, and building on this, maybe, Alan, how can African states now assert greater agency in defining migration policies that prioritize their development goals rather than succumbing maybe to this external influence?
Well, part of that will involve relationships with Europe, but most of it, I think, involves relationships with other African countries. So it's not at present easy enough for Africans, whether they are skilled or unskilled, to move to other countries and to be allowed to take jobs in the formal sector. There are some, irregular migrants, quite a lot of irregular migrants in Africa, and they are either tolerated or just not successfully policed. But there are initiatives. So there are initiatives at the continental level. There was a protocol for free movement of persons in Africa, which was agreed to at the 2018 summit of the African Union, but that didn't get any serious support after it was after the leaders signed it, but there was no ratification. There was not a lot of enthusiasm for it, and I think perhaps a continental-wide system with 55 or 54 African countries. It was too big a step to take. At the regional level, more is happening. So in the East African community, in the EAC, in ECOWAS in West Africa, in SADC in Southern Africa, there are either multilateral or bilateral agreements that have facilitated the improvement in circumstances for people moving from country to country, and in some cases made it easier for people to actually work and establish businesses in neighboring countries as well in a formal way. But I think this is probably Africa's greatest challenge at the moment, is how do we allow for greater managed movement of Africans so that they can work and live in other countries.
Yes,
in
regular pathways.
Yeah, regular pathways in Africa.
In this regard, I would like to remind that the absorption capacity of African countries to take African migration may be close to the limit. For decades since independence, it was a pretty open market, as you said. I mean, they were tolerated, even if they couldn't access the formal employment market, they were tolerated as irregular migrants. But what we see is an increase of nationalist approaches in Africa too, in many countries. Increased border control, even if in many cases it is very lackluster, but still increased in border control, and even some backlashes against foreign populations in South Africa and other countries, not only South Africa. So I think we must be prepared to see less, despite what Alan was saying, less migration to other African countries and more attempts to reach where the migrants are actually needed. Regarding the regional economic communities and the attempts to create areas of free movement of persons within the continent at sub-regional level, I think there are two major issues that prevent this to happen in a smooth way. There are some examples like ECOWAS of visa-free movement among the 15 countries, which have worked pretty well. But the first problem is these regional economic communities are not communities of law. They are political communities, and commitment can be retreated at any point. We have seen even membership to ECOWAS can be questioned overnight, which is not the case in a community of law. There is a regulated procedure to get out of like Brexit, for instance, in the European Union, it took many years. And second, most of these countries, regardless of the level of formal democracy in terms of elections and others, they are in fact not subject to the rule of law. And this makes that commitments taken at regional level are very often not implemented at all. We see before the pandemic, even in 2019, Nigeria closing its border overnight to Benin, to Togo, without actually consulting at all with the ECOWAS partners.
But really, regarding this migration governance, we can agree maybe that it exists somewhere between the national policies, but also the mandates of some regional and supranational organizations like the EU or other regional organizations, but also the EU. How can we address, this issue in terms of harmonization, in terms of conversions, and so on?
Well, as Imane says, they're not communities of law to the extent in Africa, to the extent that the EU is a community of law. So the EU has legal powers, and sovereignty lies with the EU, with the subsidiarity and all those arrangements. But there is a high degree of sovereignty with the European Union itself. So most of the EU is far from that. Some of the regional organizations are closer to that. So, for example, in the East African community, there is an East African Court of Justice, which is able to consider perhaps breaches, for example, of the East African Integration Treaty. In some cases, the decisions of the East African Court of Justice are observed. In other cases, the decisions of the East African Court of Justice are not observed. So we're moving very slowly in that direction, but sovereignty still remains with the states. So, for example, if you're a Kenyan and you want to work in Uganda, you need to get a permit to work in Uganda, but it is now very easy for Kenyans to work in Uganda and vice versa, and Rwanda. So those three countries in East Africa have actually moved further down the road than any of the other countries in East Africa and most other countries in Africa. I think I disagree a little bit with Imane on the periodization. During the colonial era, there was a lot of movement within colonial systems. So with the French colonial, the Portuguese colonial system, the British colonial system, and so on. So people would move from the inland areas to the coastal areas to work on plantations and whatever. At the point of independence, although there was a lot of talk about Pan-Africanism, the policies were nationalistic, especially after about 5 or 10 years when the economic success that was hoped for hadn't been achieved, and governments felt more and more responsible to their own people. I think that in the last decade or two, things are opening up again. And I'm more hopeful than Imane is about the possibilities for further migration within Africa.
Yeah. Let's hope that you're right. In any case, coming back to your question about migration governance, I think it's an extraordinary complex issue, also because we don't have a multilateral system of governance of international migration. And this means that you have a continental level, both in Europe and in Africa. In Europe, much more constraining and based on a community of law. In the African Union, much more politically determined and more issue of political will, nothing more. Then you have the national levels where, as I mentioned before, for most of the countries in Africa, migration is not a priority. For most of the countries of Europe, in Europe, migration is the priority. And this is a major difference. And then you have international organizations in Africa playing a very important role in migration management, and the EU. And the EU coming in Africa, trying to determine the agenda, the political agenda priorities in migration field for partner countries on the basis of its own interest. And in Europe, also with a very complex system where the European Union is competent for visa policies, for instance, but it is not competent at all, and for border control more and more, but it is not competent at all for labor migration. And this creates the distortion, actually, that prevents Europe also of having an integrated package. The nice guys are always the member states who can offer legal pathways for migration. The bad guys is always the European Union who cannot. And then it tries to make up for this gap through cooperation, through talent partnerships and other mechanisms, but it is not enough.
Yes.
In any case, just I would like to point something. We are used to consider, and politically it is true, that for Europe and the European Union, migration is a big priority, and in particular, fighting irregular migration from Europe. But I would like to call your attention to two figures. In 2015, when the migration crisis in Europe, Europe decided to create a EU trust fund for fighting against root causes of migration in Africa. Mm-hmm. We can all agree on which are the root causes.
I'm not sure about that. We'll
get back to that. Anyway, most probably we would. But it mobilized €5.5 billion euros over a 10 years period for the whole continent, for 26 countries in the whole continent. When Europe has true priorities, for instance, in 2008, to not allow Greece to get out of the euro, it mobilized 288 billion euros overnight. After the pandemic, it mobilized 750 billion euros overnight in the Resilience and Recovery Fund. So there is a gap between the lip service on how important migration is and the actual resources devoted to that in the case of the European Union.
Just to wrap up, when speaking about the priorities, do you think regional integration is prioritized over global migration narratives, as we mentioned
within
earlier?
Africa?
Yes, but also at the European level.
Yes, I think so in both cases. I think obviously, Europe absorbing new members, as it did over the last 20 years or so, did have opportunities really to integrate and for people to move within Europe and find jobs. So that was a very important part of Europe's development in recent times. In Africa, well, clearly, there's not a lot of migration into Africa. There is some migration into Africa, but it's relatively small. But I think it's the movement of Africans between African countries, skilled Africans, and some countries have better education systems and not very strong economies. Other countries have strong economies and weaker education systems. There are opportunities for movement in Africa, which I think are growing in importance.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Just to answer your question, I think that in the field of migration, we are still in the prehistory. I don't think the real alternative is between the multilateral system and regional integration. We are still at the level of national sovereignty. And you see it in the Global Compact on Migration. In the first sentence, the first thing they say, no provision in this compact will undermine the sovereignty of their member states to establish their migration policies.
Supranational organizations. True progress will require indeed both continents to move beyond historical biases and commit to policies that recognize the migration dual potential as like both challenge and the force for good. Thank you very much to our distinguished guest, Ivan Martin, Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, and Alan Hirsch from the New South Institute, and you're a Research Fellow. Thank you very much to our audience for tuning on, and see you soon.